Good afternoon. And thank you. And a very warm welcome to Lessons in Leadership, in conversation with Dominic Barton and Dr Andrew Kuper. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people who are the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us today. And now it is my very great pleasure to welcome to the stage UNSW Chancellor, Mr. David Gonski, AC.
Thank you, Jane, ladies and gentlemen. It is the sign of a great university, or indeed, I think, a very great alumni of a university, that we can attract two great speakers like we've got here today. And not just speakers of our own society, but indeed world speakers. Speakers who are doing things all over the world. And I'm pretty proud of it, and I've been looking forward to this. So I welcome each and every one of you here. And if I may, let me tell you a bit about the speakers today. Firstly, Dr Andrew Kuper. Andy is a multi-award-winning entrepreneur and investor whose philosophy of profit with purpose has shaped various industries and countries. He founded LeapFrog in 2007, and today LeapFrog companies reach 178 million people. There's no decimal point wrong there. 178 million people with healthcare or financial services. Over 146 million are low-income emerging consumers, and they're often accessing essential services for the first time thanks to the investments of LeapFrog. In 2017, LeapFrog was named by Fortune as one of the top 5 companies to change the world, alongside little companies like Apple and Novartis. Portfolio companies of LeapFrog operate across 35 countries, and they've grown close to 40% per year and now employ 128,000 people. Recently, LeapFrog announced a new Australian dollar $1 billion private equity fund, backed by several of the world's leading institutional investors focused on acquiring and growing companies in emerging markets in Asia and in Africa. And he's been recognised by the Economist Group for demonstrating how to change the way we invest as individuals, institutions and societies. He's been recognised by EY as Entrepreneur of the Year and by the AFR as one of Australia's 20 true leaders. He holds a PhD from Cambridge, is the author of 2 books on governance and democracy, and the co-author of multiple publications with diverse leaders. But I've left the one great thing out. His wife, who is absolutely wonderful, is a member of our teaching group at the law school of the University of New South Wales. I thought if I just said that, I didn't need to say the rest. He will be talking to Dominic Barton. Dom kick-started a fruitful career at McKinsey & Company in 1986. He had notable positions in the 2000s, heading their offices in Asia and Korea. And as you know, McKinsey's is a well-known and trusted advisor to many of the world's most influential businesses. Having served maximum term as McKinsey's global managing partner until 2018, Dom has successfully led the firm's pivotal focus on the future of capitalism and the role business leadership can play in creating long-term social and economic value. He is based in London with his family, but retains significant positions all over the world, including chair of the Canadian Minister of Finance's Advisory Council on Economic Growth, and this one I love, being the Chancellor of the University of Waterloo, a university that has a lot of similarity to our own. He's also a trustee of the Brookings Institution, a Rhodes trustee, and an adjunct professor of Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's also a board member of FCLT Global, which focuses on capital on the investment on the long term. He's helped done all sorts of things. He was born in Uganda, he's a Canadian, and above all, having listened to him this morning, he's absolutely bloody marvellous. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me enormous pleasure to invite Andy and Dom to the stage.
Well, thank you, David. It's going to be hard not to disappoint after that. Welcome, everybody, today. We're going to be having very much a stimulating conversation, I hope, on some of the major themes that confront business and society today. It's a privilege to be here with Dom, who has been such a leader and a thinker in this space for a long time, author of things like Reimagining Capitalism, and someone who, during his tenure at McKinsey, used to speak to a CEO or a non-profit leader or a government leader twice, two of them, every day for those 9 years. So there's arguably no one who has a larger N, a larger sample of what leaders are thinking about than Dom. And what I asked Dom to do right at the beginning was just to talk to us, give us the big picture of how he thinks this world, both societies and economies, are being reframed by the major forces out there currently. And I thought we should start there and then go into the Q&A. So with that, Dom, over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you, David, for having me here. It's wonderful to be with this group. I apologize, as a McKinsey person, I can't speak without slides. I'm trying to get off the detox, but you're going to have to see a couple of slides, so I apologize. Andy has done his best to stop me, but I did have three max. I just wanted to show. But it's more just to set the scene, if you will, and I think these are probably pretty well known, but just the context as we think about the times we're in and why I think we need to be rethinking a lot of things about our systems, capitalism, democracy, and so forth. And the reason I say that is because I think there are four really gravitational forces that are underway that we all need to be aware of. One is this sort of shift in economic power, which we're, I'd say, in the early middle stages of, between a movement from the west to the east. And for the last 3,000 years, most of the global economy was in Asia. Actually, if you put the center of the earth on a flat piece of paper to try and balance it, it would be around Islamabad in Pakistan in the year zero. Over 2,000 years, it went to Iceland, as Europe and North America moved. What's going to happen is in 75 years, what took us 2,000 years to go to Iceland, 75 years, we're going right back just a little bit north of Islamabad, just in terms of the weight of the economic of the earth, if you will, the GDP. So this shift is massive. I think we underestimate how big it is, and particularly in McKinsey, where we like to advise people on what to do. We never really take our own advice, which is a shame. When I look at it, I look at what we look like as an institution in terms of our partnership. Do we reflect what the world looks like today and what it's going to look like? We don't, and we need to move quicker. There's going to be 1.6 billion new middle-class consumers coming into the system in the world over the next 20 years. The bulk of those individuals will be in the Asia-Africa region, very much where LeapFrog is focused. And again, to put it in terms that I can understand, in North Asia, what that means in the next 10 years is we'll need 76 Unilevers to be created just to meet the needs, the consumer needs of that group. So this is a massive growth opportunity. It also has very, very significant implications for climate change. We're already in deep trouble, in my view, on that front. I don't think we factored in the 1.6 billion like we should have that want to live and work and consume like we do. And that is coming at us at speed, and it's driven by urbanization. So that's one force, which in and of itself, I think, would make this next 20 to 30 years historic from a 500-year time frame, just the scale of that move. The second force is technology, which I think we're all very familiar with. I know that this university and the university that either you're a part of or you've come from is a leader on that side of things, on the technology side. But we're in the very early innings or stages of that. Larry Summers would say we're in chapter 1 of a 100-chapter book. But what technology is doing, particularly computing power, connectedness of people and things and data, is transforming everything. My view, it's transforming science and how we think about science. There are DeepMind in London is challenging the periodic table. They're not taking the orthodoxies of the periodic table as given, which is a pretty radical thing to be thinking of. I thought those were fixed. So this change is affecting every single organization on the planet. One of the challenges, and we talked a bit about this morning, is that the software or philosophy is not keeping up with the technology. McKinsey, we don't talk about our clients. One I'll mention, which you may be inspired or concerned about, is we serve the Pope in the Catholic Church, and we clearly don't serve him on religious matters because we're not qualified. It's on the ethics of AI. And again, as a son of a preacher, I didn't read the Bible well enough, but I don't think there was anything in the Bible about artificial intelligence. But if you're the leader of a large religious institution, a 2,000-year, you better have a point of view and perspective on that. But I think we're all yearning for philosophy to go with that, with the ethics to go with that, how we think about the data. And the challenge we face is technology just keeps racing ahead. It's not going to wait for that as we go through it. So this in itself is leading to some profound changes at the sort of the philosophical level, but also at the very practical job level, the reskilling that's going to be required for all of us. In Canada, in 2030, 10 million of the 18 million person workforce will not have the job that they have now. That job will be automated. That's the estimates we made with a lot of academics and business leaders. The average age of that group that will need to be reskilled is 45 years old. They're not going to be able to go back to university. We're going to have to think about, and that displacement will be existential if we don't figure out now how to deal with it. And 2030 is not that far away. So that's technology. I'm blathering too long up here. Demographics is another factor. We're going to be the oldest Earth we've been as humans in the next 10 years. More people over the age of 65 than under the age of 15. There, in China today, 260 million people over the age of 60. You just think about what that means for our traditional GDP per capita growth models, what it means for healthcare costs and how we do things. As I get older, I think it's nice that we have older people in the system, but we tend to cost more as we get older, and we tend to produce a little less. Hopefully, we'll change the thinking, but that's an issue. And then we have, in the regions that Andy's very much more familiar than me on, you have an incredibly young demographic in Africa and in the southern parts of Asia, where I grew up, as David said, in Uganda. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. And that represents its own set of challenges. And the final force is this which I think is affected by the first three forces, this yearning. And yearning's probably is less, I need more emphasis than that on it, a screaming for a better societal deal. There are middle classes around the world, excuse my language as I say it, I'm quoting someone, they're pissed off. They are not seeing democracy, capitalism as a way for them to be able to move ahead. And we're seeing the effects of that. My view, it could get a lot worse before it gets better given these trends we're seeing and what that does for displacement. And the challenge is there's no constituency or stakeholder you can look to say, are you working on that? All of us think someone's working on it. Well, the unfortunate thing is there is no one working on it. It's us that has to work on it. And that's why I think business has a broader role to play in society. If all you think about is making money and focusing on doing what you do with your consumers, and you don't think about the impact that you have on your society, which is, by the way, what Adam Smith wrote about in his very first book, in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's the duty of the entrepreneur to take care of the society in which they operate. Quite a socialist thing for Adam Smith to have said, but I think we would all do well to remind ourselves of that, because if we don't work on the system, then the system will collapse. And I'm worried about. I'm an optimist, but I'm worried about that. So that's the stage. I think I'm going to skip I have a video. Sometime if you can actually find it on YouTube. It's not my video on YouTube. You can find it. It just shows the speed of change of race cars in Indianapolis 500 versus Formula One. I'm not going to, I think for the sake of time, go through it, but what people thought was fast is very, very slow. And I think all of us, as in organizations and society, are going to have to speed up our decision-making and our approach. That doesn't mean thinking short-term. We need to be long-term, but we need to be faster in what we're doing. So I'm going to skip that.
But Holland comes in for a pit stop. Time to refuel and change tires. Lou Moore himself changes the tires. Only 4 crew members, including the driver, are allowed to work on the car. It's a tense time. Holland stays in his seat, anxious to get away. Let's watch. Tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
The final page, I say, is some of the implications are, I think, we need to set much bolder aspirations. If I may, I'm a student and learning about Australia, so I don't think I have any right to make comments, but I think there are a lot of similarities with Canada. If you think your market is Australia or you think your market is Canada, you are going to be very, very disappointed. You need to think about your market as a 400 to 500 million person market. And there are many of those markets. It's not just China. It's ASEAN, it's East Africa, it's MENA. But boldness of ambition is critical. And with technology, there's actually opportunity for coming from a relatively small place to play a bigger role, as in the example of LeapFrog. Challenging orthodoxies. I think everyone has to step back and look at the beliefs you have in terms of how your organization works. And I would argue everything except your values you should challenge. Reallocating resources, this is capital and people, the data analytics side, thinking about the businesses of tomorrow not coming from your traditional competitors from outside of your industry is probably where you're going to find a more fulfilling set of examples, and the importance of talent. The last is the one I wanted to focus on, which is your externality is no longer your externality. I think we have to be thinking much more holistically about what we do. There, in my view, is no trade-off between stakeholders and shareholders. You will not be a sustainable shareholder value-creating company if you don't think about maximizing value from stakeholders. It can be tricky. I'm not saying it's straightforward, but there is not a trade-off of I have a purpose and I'd make less money. These things actually go together, and that's why I have been and am such a huge fan of LeapFrog. This is an organization that is making a huge difference in the world. It's a very noble, inspiring purpose, but by the way, they also make a lot of, I hope I don't embarrass you, they make a lot of money. They do well, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to have more capital being applied that way. So I've talked for too long, but I hope that's just a sort of the scene setter, if you will. You probably already know this, but of some of the changes that are underway.
It's a fantastic panoptic view of what's going on in a very short space of time. Dom, let me just start with that different conception of the customer base and the opportunity in our world. So here we are in Australia, as you say, 25 million people on the doorstep of 4 billion, rising. When I started LeapFrog in January 2007, it was the month that Steve Jobs launched the iPhone. And our shtick was, there are going to be 1 billion or 2 people added to the economy. And of course, it ended up being billions. The number of customers in the world doubled. The cost of reaching them went down 100-fold. And now, in the next few years, there are going to be 3.5 billion smartphones added. So you're going to get a multiplier of 100 on the quality of interaction with those customers. So the scale and the depth and intensity of it is far beyond what the Steve Jobs and others conceived of at that time. And I guess what it leads me to ask is, we hear that we need to move fast. We hear that companies need to be more digital and adopt digital tools and move quickly to engage with this broader world. But do you have examples where you say, these kinds of companies have really jumped on this, they've seized this, they've moved fast enough, they're understanding these customers quickly and addressing them in unique and new ways that you think are good examples for us to think about?
Yeah, there are a number, and it's not just the startups, if you will. I think there's many examples we all know. The ones that come to mind, one is Ping An in China. I don't know if people have heard of Ping An. It started out as an insurance company. It's now in healthcare, and I'll just give you one example. The chairman, Peter Ma, is about 68 years old. He might as well be 19. He's got more energy than most 19-year-olds that I know. And his mantra, if you will, is urgency and speed. And just the example I'll give you about this. He's a very successful insurance company. He decided he was going to go into healthcare. This is about 3-4 years ago. And I remember I've known him for a long time. And usually when I go to him, I'm usually telling him not to do so. I said, he went from insurance to banking. I said, you're not allowed to do it. He said, watch me. And he moved to Beijing and worked with the regulators. He said, my idea now is I'm going into healthcare. And I said, first of all, you don't have a license to do that. But I know you're going to try and figure out how to get it. Because second, healthcare is very different than financial. So you can kill people if you don't. I sort of went, and he said, that's interesting, Dom. You always say, watch me. So he proceeded shortly after that, a very productive counseling session, to hire 1,000. He hired 1,000 doctors. He put them in the equivalent of a call center. Might say a very nice call center, but put them into a call center. And his product, and he didn't need McKinsey's help for this at all, was you can call the call center. Anyone in China can call the call center 12 times a year for the equivalent of $100 in renminbi. That was the product. Nothing else. Not going to say how long it is. That's the product. He today has 232 million customers, right, that have signed up on that pay money. It's a very, very significant, sort of one of the largest healthcare companies in the world. But what's more interesting is the data he now has on what's ailing the average Chinese person. So he's built all sorts of research centers, cancer research. I'm involved with Sloan Kettering. I'm on the board in New York, which is a leading cancer center, and saying if you want to be relevant in the next 10 years, you're going to have some sort of a joint venture with Ping An. You have to. So I'm just saying this. He's 68. A lot of people would be telling him to be retiring, playing golf. He's just very frustrated he didn't buy Didi, the Uber equivalent, and so forth. That's one of his. So you see organizations. Another one I mentioned briefly this morning, Inditex. This is from Spain. It's the company that owns Zara. So it's in my view, the fastest moving supply chain of any organization I know of on the planet. And it's got a very unusual structure, basically 2 levels, senior level of executives and then a very large group of people. And I still to this day can't figure out how they're organized. Thank goodness they don't rely on McKinsey to do what they're doing, but it's very difficult but they make decisions very quickly. It's an old school, it's from Madrid, it's not from the Silicon Valley and yet it is a global leader in terms of how it works. So those would be 2 that come to mind.
We've also seen orthodoxies around how industry verticals are organized collapsing. Right? So your case makes me think of a group we own in East Africa called Good Life, which is started out as a pharmacy chain, but essentially discovered that 50% of people first get their healthcare interaction at the pharmacy because there aren't that many doctors. So they then created little stalls that had teledoctor services. So you go and you sit down at the computer, talk to a doctor in Nairobi. Then they thought, well, we need to be able to take the bloods here. So they introduced the path lab and they created a health hub, essentially. And now they're linking in insurers where you can walk in, you're miles out in the middle of East Africa, get your drugs prescribed, the pharmacist gives you the right thing. Normally you've got 1/3 of medications or the wrong medications in Kenya. Now you get the right one, the insurer instantly pays. You have a much better experience than you have here in Sydney, where I get my piece of paper from my doctor, walk over to my pharmacy, right, call my insurer, go through this very ineffective process. And I think what it shows is, that's healthcare and financial services coming together, but it also shows how poorly our current enterprises are designed, because they're designed for what works from the enterprise perspective. It's not designed from the customer perspective. From the customer perspective, you want a seamless interaction. You don't care whether it comes from healthcare or financial services. And as I look at the Gojeks in Indonesia or a number of the other players that are disrupting these markets, they do seem to be providing this panoply of services rather than thinking in a much narrower way in the way Peter Myers.
There's some overused terms right now that probably irritate people, including myself, but, agile and ecosystem and, but at the risk of irritating you, if I think of this ecosystem notion, I totally agree. I think we tend to think of ourselves as B2C, if you will, and this sounds very obvious. And I remember listening to Jack Ma, who's on this Singapore Economic Development Board, and so it gets together once a year, and there's sort of 10 CEOs there, and he started to talk, and he said, I want to tell you guys, the world's shifting from B2C to C to B. And I was drinking off, I was like, wow, that's an insight, this is Jack Ma, and he says, you're not listening. It's going from B to C to C to B. And this is just as they were beginning to go into financial services, right? And there was some bankers on there, and he said, by the way, I'm lending anywhere between $10,000 to $100 to our customers. And people said, well, you're not a bank. And he said, no kidding, I'm not a bank. And he said, well, we have more data than you. I know what shampoo you're using. I know how many kids. I know where that. I know blah blah. So I have much better data than your risk people do. Anyhow, he said, by the way, I don't think people wake up in the morning saying, I want to go to a bank. And I hope I'm not insulting it. Banking's great, David. I don't want to say, but it's kind of like, I remember this, I used to work with a lot of gas station companies, and there was this obsession that all people think about every day is the price of gas and going to a gas station. It's kind of, that's an irritant, actually. But you've now got people thinking about those systems, right? Whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in mobility, whether it be in educate. There are these broader systems, and I do think one needs to think about how you place yourself, and that means that you're not really. You have to think about competitors in a very different way. The one thing I would say too is one part of the world where I've found there's China, and we can talk about that in Silicon Valley. That surprises me about the amount of change towards these ecosystems, and so is Chile. And I think it's because it's such an open system. They don't have any tariffs, but it's incredible to see what banks, oil and gas retailers are doing, and they're moving maybe not as fast as the Kenyan, but they're moving. Incumbents are moving that way. So I think that is going to be more of our future.
And I'm just going to ask one question, and then I'll open to the audience. But it is about Australia's place in the world. You say we should be thinking not about the 25 million here, but the 500 million in Asia. We are on a similar time zone. We are close. But people have had some mixed experiences, and a lot of large institutions have been punished by analysts for who have a much more short-term orientation for having adventurous forays into Asia. How do we begin to shift this mindset? I know you're part of the Focusing Capital on the long-term efforts. How do we begin to move away from the quarteritis that is afflicting our societies and our investment decisions currently, and towards a more long-termist notion? Because clearly in those terms, you do have to seize this historic opportunity as Australian companies and Australian society.
Yeah, and I think you've framed the challenge very well. I think in some ways it's obvious that the markets and the opportunity are in Asia, and I would argue in Africa. I'm very bullish on Africa, and I know that there can be, well, many people have been bullish over the years, but I am, and maybe it's I've drank the Kool-Aid, so I'm probably totally biased. But then there's a difference between how do you get there, and I think you do need patient. They can still be demanding, patient capital to be able to drive it. And it is interesting when you look at some of the what I'd call more long-term oriented companies. Many of them are families that are the time frames. One example I would give you is the Oleon Group. It's run by, it's a second generation family, originally out of Saudi Arabia, but long time left. They're in New York and London. Their time frame is 50 years. And when you see, and they invest a lot of capital, and when you see how they look at the world and where they're, where the trends are and where the shifts are, they're willing. They can put up with the ups and downs. It will not be Africa will not be a smooth ride. Also, Asia won't be a smooth ride. But you need people who are willing to stick with you. And the only other thing I would say, and again, I don't have any right to do this, not being a Canadian here in Australia. But I really would urge this notion of 25 million. That's a small city in China, if I might say. What I would say what I've said to the Canadians all the time is, we'd say, well, we need to shift our focus from the United States, where the bulk of our activity is, towards Asia. Everyone's talking about big free trade agreements, and so I said, how about this? How about we just develop a relationship with the city of Chongqing? Chongqing has 35 million people. That's the size of Canada. We'll double our market with just a relationship with them. How about the mayor of Shanghai or of Chongqing? So there are so many cities out there that we could be linked with, and I think universities play a big role. One, because universities attract talent from those parts of the world. I don't know what the mix is at this university, but it's also, I think, really important for students and people here to spend time in these parts of the world. All it takes is in my view, a 2-month trip to see something and go, I can operate in this environment. I'll bet you the alumni network here, that's already, I see, is huge, but it's a link. And the last thing one of the reasons I got interested in Asia was actually because of an experience I had here I don't know if I've told you this before, Andy, in Australia. As a young associate, I spent a year in Australia, mainly because my best friend was Australian, so I wanted to just spend time with him. And the very first project we did was actually for the federal government. It was to simplify the tax system. You can see how effective we were in that work. But the more important thing was the client was Paul Keating, right? It was Greg Smith, but Paul Keating. And we had 2 dinners with Paul Keating. That was the interaction we had. And I hadn't met this person or seen him. I heard about him, but I'd not. In the first dinner, we were drinking a lot of wine, and he said the big idea at the table was we should merge Canada, Australia, and Ireland into one country. and I was so excited. it was 11 o'clock at night. I probably drank a little too. I called the managing partner at the time of McKinsey, Fred Glock, who liked ideas, and said, I need to talk to Fred. I got a big idea. And the secretary, he said, who's this? I said, it's Dominic Barton. He said, you're in Australia. It's late at night. I said, yeah, I've got a big idea. I want to tell. I said, I think we should merge Australia, Canada. And there was silence for a bit, and he said, what's your name again? And, at which point I gave my best friend's name. And then he said to me, he goes, I have a suggestion for you, Dom. He said, first of all, I suggest you leave the firm and then you pursue the idea outside of it. But the second dinner I just wanted to get to was we had this dinner, and I remember this Paul Keating, and I just remember this amazing suit and all. He looked at me, and he kind of, with his head cocked, and he had said to me, I can't do his accent, but I remember this vividly, he said, if you have half a brain, and I'm not sure you do, you would do well to move to Asia. And I remember going, this was 1989, I said, are you certain? Like, what? Is that feedback that we're not doing very well? And he said, that's the future. That's where it is. And someone of your age, if you want to do, you should go. And I didn't move to Asia, right? But that seed sort of sank into my skull and this notion. So we've been talking about this for a long time. And there's not we better get moving, is all I'd say, because we can see it happening, and it's not rocket science to figure out how to be able to get there. So I feel very, very strongly about it. On the Canadian side, with the university that I'm involved, I'm just encouraged. We have to have a program that every student that wants to be able to spend time, and I'm not in Germany, sorry, not in Vienna, sorry, that's nice. If you want to do that, you can do it. In Asia, I don't care where you want to go, we should figure out a way for them to be able to get that experience, because and the benefit will be in 10 to 15 years.
And eventually you were running McKinsey China and McKinsey Asia, so there you go. Amazing, the influence.
No one wanted
people.
to go, that's why.
I'm going to open up, and I think just in the interest of efficiency, we'll take 3 questions. There are mics, so if people could just wait until the mic reaches your mouth before you ask your question. So let me look. There's one over there. I'll say there's one there. And I'm looking for another one. And one over there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Michael Collins, a graduate of the AGSM and UNSW. Fascinating conversation. One thing that struck me was your recommendation to hold fast on your values. I was wondering how that might translate, given that values aren't necessarily homogeneous across all countries, and certainly not between Asia and the rest of the world, or not even within Asia.
Great question. Can I borrow a piece of paper? We'll take questions, a bunch of questions. Yeah. Okay.
Who did I point out as the second now? Yep, there we go.
Where's the question now?
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Jordan Lee. I have a question for Dom, please. Since you travel the world, have important positions. My focus is around the younger people. You know, they are the future. How do you compare the education for school students and university students? I know it's a big question, but just in general.
Around the world? Like
Australia in comparison with the world, the rest of the world.
Okay.
And I know Dom's very passionate about education, so that's a great tee up. And I had one over there. This man over here. Sorry.
My name is Michael Tan, I graduated in 1980. My question is about China and the political system there and what is currently happening in Hong Kong. Because we can talk about we need to move to Asia, but the politics of the Communist Party certainly leaves me much room for anxiety.
There you go, very small
question.
questions there, Dom.
So what do you think?
Future of education, future of China. Yeah. Over to you.
Wow, that's a great question. I think just on the values one, it's a great point. I think it's hard to say that there's a universal set. What I was more focused on was any organization has a set of values. They don't have, and what I was saying is those are things I would hold dear. They may be around the purpose. They may be on how you operate, the principles of how you operate. Those are the things I was saying I would hold fast to, but everything else I would put on the table. I remember this from Samsung, and you could argue it's a great example, not a great example. When the chairman of Samsung they were going through a major change program in 1998. They were, first of all, not seen as a consumer goods company. They were a manufacturer, sort of a low-cost manufacturer. Their products, you might find them in a Walmart. You wouldn't find them in any of the high-end stores. So it was a massive transformation. And the way he went in there, he said, he went to all the employees, 200,000, and he said, I expect you to change everything except your spouse. That was kind of it was like, wow, that's a pretty serious message on what's going to change. But so to me, it's the values of the company, because I think those are enduring. I think, by the way, I do think there are more in common than we may think across the system that we should look at. But that's more what I was talking about, is you really have to challenge it, because the fact of the matter is someone is going to be challenging you in where you are. That's what I meant on that. On education, I'm not saying this to be nice, but I think the Australian education system is fantastic, especially in some dimensions. If I might point out two, and this is very much coming from my lens. One is economics. The rigor. I remember that when I came here in 1989, you'd find taxi drivers talking about the weighted average cost of capital. I couldn't believe this, literally. And it was and for McKinsey was started here by Rod Carnegie, and it was started because he decided, it was 1963. Australia was not in the strategy of McKinsey, I believe, at the time, to go from New York to Melbourne. But he was a very talented person. Marvin Bauer didn't want him to leave, so he said, "Okay, you're not going to leave. You're going to do the work." And what I would say is that ever since that period of time, and it's not about Rod Carnegie, it's about the education system. The center of excellence for strategy and economic thinking, and it is to this day, has been Australia. It's just all of our frameworks, all of the courses. I'm just giving you a visceral. That's a sense. The second is technology. The innovation that goes on, and I know this because we studied it from Canada. What is it about Australia? What I would argue is you are extremely good at coming up with ideas. You're not necessarily as good at commercializing them. I don't know if it's because of a lack of growth capital, but God, you come up with ideas. Many of them get. So that's sort of my sense of where it is. The only thing where I think the challenges are, I don't think you're a very global society, if I might say. It's not a worldly. That doesn't mean not sophisticated. It's a sophisticated, but not as global in terms of where people are. That's just giving you my gut ball view on it. On China, that's a whole conversation, and probably being taped here, so I'm going to be careful what I say. My name's Andy Kuper, just in case there's any issues going on. No, I think that the commentary. I've actually moved to Hong Kong, so I now live in Hong Kong as my base. So I'm seeing it fairly frequently, some of the challenges and so forth. But it's my view that I think there's many things that we can learn from China, and we should, in terms of, for example, long-term thinking, what they've done with infrastructure, how they've actually enabled companies like Peter Ma to be allowed to grow and blossom and do things. But I don't think we should assume that system is going to be like it is today, and it's going to have to evolve as you have a larger middle class. And I think one of the biggest challenges that leadership group has is, how do you think about a transition that's done in an orderly manner? And I'm not a politician. I'm not a student of politics, but I think we should recognize that there is a left and right in the Chinese leadership. There's politics in China. It's not any different, right? We don't read about it or see it, so there's tensions, and I do think that there's going to be there is a clash of different values on that side. On, is it economic growth? China has lifted more people out of poverty than any other country has in the world. We should acknowledge that and be supportive. Okay, yeah, okay. But I think there comes a point too when a population has come out. How are people gonna? And that's going to be a challenge. And so I don't think anything's fixed. And what I found interesting about Hong Kong, at least on the first day of the protest, I wasn't actually out there protest. I was actually trying to get to a meeting, but I couldn't drive anywhere. So I was really worried. I thought they were probably filming me. I'm not going to the protest. But the thing I noticed, which was wonderful, It was families. It was quiet. There were and it was boiling. The humidity is unbelievable. But it tells you something about a group of people that believe in a certain way. I was deeply impressed with that. And so, again, I'm not really, I guess I'm blathering here, not really saying much. I'm just, the point I would make is I don't see things as black and white. I think things are going to evolve. I think things will evolve there. They ultimately have a system that has to have support with. And the one last thing I'd just say on it was 2009. I was in Shanghai. We were ordered by the NDRC to help with the stimulation. They put a massive stimulation program right as the crisis, because literally 9 months before they put the brakes on the economy because it was growing too quickly. And unfortunately, the brakes hit in October of when Lehman Brothers went. So the brakes hit. They put this program in. McKinsey was ordered. I was all excited. The project we were ordered to do was, how can you sell more televisions in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities? We're not talking about meta strategy stuff. And the precise question was, do you cut the price of the television by 25%, or do you keep the price the same and you get a 25% refund from the mayor's office? That literally was and I said, well, McKinsey, I need to see the big picture. They said, no, it's none of your business. Do the work. I said, no, we don't see the whole picture. They said, how about you do the work and then come back? So I did. I spent a lot of time in places like Kaifeng and others. It turns out, by the way, you sell more TVs if you get a refund from the mayor's office. So I was really proud. Came back. I said, now I'd like to see the big picture. And this guy said, why should I tell you? It's none of your business. And I said, well, we did this. And then he could tell he was getting very frustrated with me. He goes, you obviously, and I said, because I care deeply about China and how it's moving. And he looked at me, probably a bit like Paul Keaton, and he said, if you really care about this country, the thing that you'd be worried about is food price inflation. And I went, what the hell does that have to do with the price of tea in China? And he said, if food price inflation goes over 14%, it's over. And if you look at, because he said, and I didn't get it, so he said, see, because when people protest and they're starving, no weapons will hold them back. Nothing can hold people back. Do you understand the dynamic of it? And I became very interested in ag food after that discussion. But the point is, I think that don't underestimate how people are going to have to respond to changes. And I just think we shouldn't paint it into black and white, because it's a system that needs to evolve. There are different views people have in different parts of the country. And the thing I worry about, you know more than I do, one thing I'm concerned about is how little in the West we understand of China. You know, the Western system is really coming out of the Treaty of Westphalia. That is like a blip in the 5,000, and yet we think that's how the system works. So I think we also have to, I'm not saying that was a communist system back then, but we need to also have a deeper understanding of how the world works from a historical perspective. I'll shut up.
Dom, I guess that notion of humility as a prime business virtue is an important one when the world is speeded up so much, when the scale of change is so enormous, when it dwarfs the Industrial Revolution, what we're going through now, by 1,000 or 3,000-fold, I think is the McKinsey estimate. You've got to think very hard about how little you know, and how much you use either network or partnership systems to try and incorporate information, and how much you need to beta test and recalibrate constantly. And certainly that has been a part of the success of the Chinese companies, but also we see it in Indonesia and Thailand and Nigeria and so on, where we invest. But what it also makes me think is that humans can be a bit slow to recalibrate, and some of the technologies currently, this sheer scale of data and AI, are allowing for very, very rapid iteration that hopefully works well with humans ultimately, but rarely doing that. And I heard you say this morning that Henry Kissinger is now going to develop at 96 a philosophy of AI because he thinks it's the next big thing.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could, we spoke about young people, if you could just tell us looking now, if you're the Paul Keating character, and you're talking to someone today who's a relatively young person saying, where am I going to focus in this world? I mean, maybe you'll tell them still go to China or Indonesia or East Africa. But in terms of the kinds of areas that you think will be most interesting and transformative, where would you focus that person who asks you, where should I go?
Well, that's a great question. The way I'd sort of look at it is, first thing I'd do is I learned this from a job interview that I didn't get the job at, and it was actually a GE, and is to think about your skills in terms of soft skills and hard skills. So there's over time you're building both, and I would have literally like an inventory of that. And hard skills, if you're in business, you need to know something about marketing. You need to know how to take cost out of an organization. You know how to design. There's a whole bunch of things. Soft skills are I would argue even more important. They're things like, can you give negative feedback to someone and inspire them? How do you influence someone without power? These are, and I would actually think about an inventory that you're building. That's what that you're going to need. And I would talk to mentors. It depends on what there are people that you may admire. I would look and try and look at that and see where it is. So that's one dimension. The second dimension, I think, is that it's getting experiences. And I think sometimes we focus too much on. I would focus too much. I want to go to China or Korea or Indonesia. In my view, it doesn't matter. Just go to one of those places, and that by getting that experience for a period of time, it's going to change you. At a personal level, as I've looked back at my life so far, I've grown the most when I've been thrown into a swimming pool without knowing how to swim. It's very uncomfortable. At the time, I go, why am I doing this? Like, what drugs was I taking when I decided to be here, and what this is? But it's those places where you feel like you're learning all the time. You're being challenged. So I would look for. I do think Asia and Africa, but I literally would not try and go to where there happens to be an opportunity, and commit, and it doesn't have to be for a long time. And I would think about doing that on a regular basis, because I think with our aging population and all of the medicine and the technology and so forth, I think today one should think about having if you want, you don't have, but having a productive, career for 80 or 90 years. Like, so as we said, Henry Kissinger at 96, I found it a bit shocking saying I'm thinking about my next chapter, i.e. as though it's not my last chapter, it's my next chapter is what I'm doing, and studying and researching and so forth. So I always think, what are the S curves that you're moving on? But being uncomfortable, putting yourself in an uncomfortable place, I think is really important for personal growth. So that's I don't know if that makes any sense.
And I think you spoke earlier about questioning orthodoxies. I mean, it's interesting that, for instance, much of the investment industry was founded by people who had absolutely nothing, modern investment industry, by people who had absolutely no training in finance. Wow. They were trained typically in philosophy. And the one thing that philosophy does differently from other disciplines is it leads you to question all the assumptions. I remember my first year philosophy paper, it said, is there a table in front of you? Was the first question, right? And there is something about throwing yourself into the unknown, but also being prepared to question things that have gone unquestioned, that I think prepares you very well.
One other thing, just as you're two quick things. MOOCs, right? That are those online. What is it? You know what they mean? What I mean by them. CEOs actually do a lot of MOOCs, and do you know what the most popular MOOC course is for CEOs? It's philosophy. Most of them don't complete it, by the way. But it's interesting to your point. I totally forgot what I was going to.
Well, it's just as well because we're out of time. But I wanted to thank you, Dom. It is just extraordinary to listen to the breadth, not only of your experience but of your thinking. And I think there are a lot of lessons for folks living in Australia about technology, about the shift to the east and the south. I think we are in a very different position in the world to seize really a historic moment of opportunity. As you say, it's going to stand out in the 500-year picture as a moment of enormous opportunity. And I think at those moments, as I've learned from sitting at David Gonski's feet occasionally, and from you, those moments are profound opportunities, and the younger you are, the greater the opportunity that I think we're lucky enough to be able to seize. And having a guide like you and like David to thinking about that is really a profound thing, and I think all of us should thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking both Dominic and Andy for that absolutely fascinating conversation. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for being here with us today. I'd like to remind you to keep your contact details updated with us, then you don't miss anything. Stay connected via UNSW's social channels, and sign up to Alumni Connect, which is our new peer-to-peer global alumni mentoring platform. Have a wonderful afternoon.